Hello guys and welcome to Hidden Timelines. Before we continue, if this tale keeps you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe, and only if it truly feels natural. And now, softly tell me, where are you listening from and what hour has the night brought you? Picture yourself in a stone chamber in the middle of February. The walls sweat with cold, the air smells faintly of damp limestone, and the only light comes from thin slivers of daylight that cut through narrow arrow-slit windows. A young woman stands at the centre of the room. She is 29 years old, but in this moment she feels no older than a terrified child. Her name is Blanche of Navarre, Queen of Castile, though the crown on her head has never shielded her from humiliation. Her gown has been stripped away. Before her stand two midwives with practised, unsentimental hands. Their faces betray no warmth, only the focus of women long accustomed to serve in courts that demand loyalty to power over compassion. Beside them, seated slightly higher, is Anne of Burgundy, the Duchess of Bedford, her eyes sharp, appraising and cold. She is not here to offer comfort. She is here as witness, judge and silent executioner of Blanche's reputation. Every rustle of fabric, every shuffle of the attendants' shoes echoes too loudly against the stone. Blanche trembles, though not entirely from the chill that creeps into her bones. She knows what is at stake. For 13 years she has been married to Henry IV of Castile, a man who never touched her, a man whose indifference turned her bed into a coffin for her youth. And now, because that marriage remains childless, her body is summoned to testify against itself. The ritual is both grotesque and ordinary, for in the 15th century such examinations were not aberrations but institutions. The midwives approach lifting Blanche's skirts as if she were livestock brought to market. Their fingers press probe search for signs that no man has crossed this threshold. Blanche bites her lip until she tastes blood, her humiliation running deeper than the physical intrusion. Her body is no longer hers, it belongs to the politics of kings and priests, to men who demand proof of purity before granting her the right to be wife, queen or mother. One word from these women could shatter her. If they declare her seal broken, Blanche's life will collapse. She could be cast aside, exiled to Navarre in disgrace, whispered about in courts across Europe as a fraud. Or worse, her honour sullied, her name cursed, she could be condemned to a life of isolation, discarded, as though she had never been a queen at all. The Duchess of Bedford observes with hawk-like vigilance. She embodies the chilling paradox of medieval womanhood, a noble woman overseeing the degradation of another, bound by duty to uphold a system that devours its own daughters. Her expression reveals nothing, yet her presence magnifies Blanche's shame. It is not enough that strangers touch her most intimate flesh. A duchess must watch to ensure the verdict is unimpeachable. Outside the chamber the world bustles with winter trade knights tending horses, clerics chanting prayers, but here in this cold interior a single woman's future narrows to the fragile skin of her body. Her virginity has become evidence, her worth reduced to the state of a membrane as delicate as gossamer. This was the fate of queens in the late Middle Ages. Their beauty, wit or courage meant little. What mattered most was whether their bodies could guarantee legitimate heirs. A kingdom's stability, alliances between dynasties, even peace or war, all could hinge on whether a woman bled on her wedding night or whether her examiners swore she remained untouched. Royal women were not individuals but commodities, currency in a marketplace of dynastic power. Blanche knows this. She knows that if she passes today's ordeal, she wins no freedom, no love. At best, she secures her place for a little longer in a game she did not choose to play. At worst, she buys only another chapter of confinement, her body traded again in negotiations beyond her control. The midwives withdraw at last. The silence is unbearable. Blanche keeps her eyes lowered, praying to hear words that will not destroy her. The Duchess leans forward slightly enough to signal the weight of her authority. For a moment, the entire kingdom of Castile seems to hang in that breathless pause, waiting for the judgment of weathered fingers and weary eyes. And in this pause lies the heart of medieval womanhood, a world where queens could command armies with their names but not their own bodies, where saints and heroines were revered for their purity yet humiliated to prove it, where the fate of nations rested not on treaties or swords but on whether a woman's body bore the signs men demanded to see. 13 years. That was how long Blanche of Navarre remained the wife of Henry IV of Castile without once being touched as a woman by her husband. 13 winters and summers of lying beside him, the weight of expectation pressing heavier than any crown, while the bed between them stayed colder than the stone walls of the palace. Marriage in the 15th century was not meant to be about affection. It was about alliance, heirs, and the perpetuation of dynasties. But even by the standards of a political union, theirs was an extraordinary failure. At first, the silence of their bedchamber was a private matter whispered only among the closest ladies-in-waiting, dismissed as the shy hesitancy of a young couple. Yet as the years passed, that silence grew louder, echoing down the corridors of Castile's court. In a world where a queen's worth was measured by her womb, and a king's by his virility, 13 barren years could not be ignored. Rumours began to coil through the court like smoke from an unseen fen. Some said Henry was impotent, a man too weak or too timid to claim his wife. Others suggested divine punishment, that God himself had closed Blanche's womb as judgment against Castile. A few dared to whisper that the fault lay with Blanche, that her body was barren, her beauty only a city, a mask for hidden decay. The truth mattered less than the whispers. Once doubt was spoken, it spread like disease. Gossip was not idle chatter in royal courts. It was a weapon sharper than any dagger. Courtiers traded stories in the shadowed alcoves of palaces, their tongues crafting alliances as carefully as scribes drafted treaties. A rumour about a queen's coldness or a king's weakness could alter the balance of power. Every servant who dressed Blanche, every nobleman who bowed before Henry, every foreign envoy who visited Castile became part of the theatre, where silence in the royal bed played out as public spectacle. The pressure to produce an heir was relentless. A child would have quieted every whisper, sealed every alliance, and secured the dynasty. Without one, Blanche's position was fragile, Henry's legitimacy precarious. A king who could not sire children and invited rivals, a queen who could not bear the men invited suspicion. Even neighbouring rulers eyed Castile hungrily, for a kingdom without heirs was a kingdom ripe for conquest. Blanche lived under the gaze of those who measured her worth by what she had not given. Every banquet, every procession, every mass was an unspoken reminder of her failure. Ladies smiled politely, but glanced at her belly flat year after year. Ambassadors reported back to their kings not only about Castile's treasury or armies, but about whether Blanche of Navarre showed signs of pregnancy. Her body was a ledger, and every month it recorded only absence. An empty marriage bed was not only a personal tragedy, it was a political crisis. Across Europe, dynasties were woven together like fragile tapestries held in place by threads of blood and inheritance. When those threads frayed, wars followed. A barren queen could unmake treaties signed in gold, could undo the work of generations. Blanche knew that her silence beside Henry was no secret, it was a void that threatened to swallow the stability of kingdoms. And what of Henry? His role in this silent drama was no less subject to speculation. Some whispered that he preferred the company of young men, others that he was cursed with a hidden affliction that left him incapable. Chroniclers called him Henry the Impotent, though whether this was truth or propaganda mattered little. The stain of the nickname endured. To admit his failure was to admit weakness, so that the blame often fell upon Blanche instead. It was easier for a king to accuse his queen of barrenness than to confess his own inability. For Blanche, the cruelty was double-edged. She endured not only the neglect of a husband who would not touch her, but the suspicion of a court eager to lay failure at her feet. Each night she lay awake beside Henry, the silence between them a wound that deepened with time. Her body longed for warmth, for recognition, for the chance to fulfill the role that was demanded of her. Yet she remained untouched, her youth withering in a marriage that was nothing more than a gilded cage. In those years, Blanche must have known that her fate was not unique. Across Europe, royal women were bound into marriages that cared little for their desires, but while others were forced into beds they did not choose, Blanche was denied even that. Her marriage was not violent, but it was erasure 13 years of invisibility, of existing as a queen in name, but never as a wife in truth. The irony was brutal. To prove her worth as a queen, she would one day be forced to bare her body before strangers to let them search for evidence of a virginity that should have been long lost in marriage. Her untouched body, which had condemned her for years, would become her only defence. And so the cold silence of her marriage bed led directly to that stone chamber in 1453, where Blanche's dignity hung in the balance, subject not to love or loyalty, but to the verdict of others. In the medieval imagination, virginity was more than a personal state, it was a form of currency. A queen's body was not her own. It was a coin stamped with purity proof that her husband's heirs would be beyond dispute. In a world where dynasties rose and fell on questions of bloodlines, the presence or absence of a fragile membrane could determine the fate of kingdoms. Inheritance was the beating heart of medieval politics. Castles, armies, land, and titles all passed through the narrow channel of legitimate birth. If a child's paternity was ever doubted, the entire edifice of power trembled. And so purity became insurance. A virgin bride guaranteed that the first child she bore would be her husband's, the father's name etched into the future with certainty. The hymen, misunderstood and mythologized, became a seal of authenticity more binding than ink on parchment. For Blanche of Navarre, as for countless others, her untouched state was not an accident of neglect, but a commodity that could be measured, tested, and if proven redeemed for political value. She was not alone in this cruel arithmetic. Across Christendom, courts from England to Hungary treated virginity as a contract written on the body of a woman. The obsession was not uniquely European. In the Byzantine Empire, imperial princesses were guarded like treasures, their chastity considered vital to the sacred authority of the dynasty. A Byzantine bride who entered her husband's chamber unspoiled was seen as carrying the sanctity of the Virgin Mary herself, a symbolic guarantee of divine favour upon the empire. Dowries of gold and land were meaningless if the bride's body could not be vouched for. In the Islamic courts of the Middle East too, virginity was a prized assurance of legitimacy. While Islamic law recognised the rights of women more broadly than their European counterparts, the politics of dynastic marriage still made purity essential. The wives of caliphs, sultans and emirs were scrutinised as carefully as their European sisters. A caliph's harem might teem with women of dazzling beauty and wit, but only a virgin bride of noble blood could anchor a political alliance beyond dispute. Even farther east in the great courts of China's dynasties, the obsession with bloodlines took on its own ritual forms. Emperors demanded empresses, and high consorts whose chastity was beyond question for the mandate of heaven itself was thought to flow through the purity of their unions. The intricate genealogies of noble families, the endless records of birth and marriage, all revolved around the assumption that a woman entered her husband's house untouched. If she did not only her honour, but the stability of the dynasty itself could unravel. Everywhere the logic was the same, dynasties survived only if bloodlines were believed to be pure. And because men could never truly know, they demanded proof. This obsession reduced women to bargaining chips in the great market of dynastic politics. Their virginity was weighed against dowries, balanced against treaties appraised like jewels or silver. A king might forgive a small dowry, but never a tarnished reputation. A nobleman might risk his fortune in war, but he would not risk his lineage on a woman whose chastity was in question. The cruelty of this system was that it placed women in an impossible position. Virginity was a commodity they were forced to sell exactly once, and the sale had to be perfect. A mistake, an accusation, even an accident of biology could destroy them. And unlike other commodities, this one could never be replenished. A lost dowry could be repaid, a broken treaty renegotiated. But once a woman was deemed spoiled, no amount of money or diplomacy could restore her value. The men who trafficked in this currency understood its fragility, and so they devised the tests humiliating, invasive, absurd to reassure themselves that the commodity they traded was still intact. These examinations were less about truth than about power. By reducing queens, princesses and noble women to objects of inspection, kings and priests reminded the world who held authority. The spectacle of a woman stripped and judged was not just about purity, it was about control. And yet beneath the cruelty there was always fear. Men feared illegitimacy, feared rival claimants, feared that their line might end not because of war or plague, but because of doubt. And so they clung to virginity as a talisman, a superstition wrapped in ritual, a desperate attempt to impose certainty on a world that never offered it. Blanche of Navarre's examination was part of this greater economy. Her untouched body, once a source of quiet shame in her empty marriage, became her last remaining asset. It was proof that her husband's neglect had left her untainted, and that proof, humiliating though it was to provide, might save her crown. In the marketplace of purity, her body was both the coin and the merchandise traded between men who would never feel the sting of the judgment she endured, and she was far from alone. Across cultures, across centuries, women bore the weight of dynasties on their skin, reduced to a single question: untouched or not. The most obvious and perhaps the most invasive method of determining a woman's purity was the direct inspection of the hymen. To medieval minds, this fragile membrane was a kind of divine seal, a physical lock placed upon a woman's body until her husband opened it. The fact that hymens vary widely from woman to woman, that some are thin and break from riding a horse, others are elastic and remain intact even after childbirth, and some are absent altogether. None of this mattered to those who claimed authority. For them, the hymen was truth made flesh. Its absence was guilt. Its presence was virtue. But the medieval appetite for certainty and its terror of deception did not stop at anatomy. Physicians and priests alike craved rituals that could reveal hidden corruption. They cloaked superstition in the robes of science, turning kitchens, gardens, and even bodily functions into stages for judgment. Consider the sieve test absurd in its simplicity and cruel in its consequences. A maiden would be handed a sieve filled with water. If she was pure, the water would not leak through the holes. If she was corrupt, it would pour out like spilled reputation. Onlookers would watch her trembling as she hands her desperate attempts to tilt and hold the sieve steady, as though gravity itself were a moral force. No matter how absurd the test, the humiliation was real. A slip, a spill, a single drop running down her wrist could mean disgrace. And then there were the urine tests. Learned men of the 13th and 14th centuries claimed that virginity altered the very chemistry of a woman's body. A virgin's urine, they said, was clear, sparkling, sometimes white like pearl, while that of the unchaste was clouded or foul-smelling. Some insisted on observing how a young woman relieved herself, noting whether the stream hissed, trickled, or sprayed. To modern ears, it sounds grotesque, almost comic, but in a world where the wrong verdict could condemn a woman to death or exile, there was nothing laughable about it. Imagine noble daughters of kings and dukes forced to squat before physicians, their faces burning as men scribbled notes about the virtue revealed in the sound of liquid striking metal. Imagine mothers, cousins, ladies of the court looking on in silence, knowing the result could determine marriages worth millions in land and gold. These practices expose not only the ignorance of medieval medicine, but also its willingness to bow to superstition when political stability demanded it. Physicians draped themselves in the authority of Galen and Hippocrates, quoting ancient texts with solemn gravity, yet their science was little more than ritual theatre. They spoke of humours of fluids that revealed character of organs that betrayed the soul, and courts believed them because they wanted to believe them. Superstition was not simply tolerated, it was statecraft. A king who needed to dissolve a marriage could call upon physicians to declare his wife no virgin. A rival court could challenge a queen's legitimacy by demanding new tests. These rituals dressed up as objective truth became weapons in the arsenals of power. They gave rulers the illusion of certainty, the means to cloak political decisions in the authority of medicine and religion. For the women subjected to them, however, they were ordeals. Every test was a trial, every result a judgment on her worth. It mattered little whether the method was anatomical inspection, sieve, or chamber pot. What mattered was the theatre of humiliation, the reminder that her body was never her own. In these strange trials of innocence, the personal and the political blurred into one. A woman's most private functions became public evidence. Her body was turned inside out not only to prove her purity, but to reassure anxious kings and trembling dynasties that their bloodlines remained unbroken. And so superstition masquerading as medicine became the machinery by which kingdoms rose or fell. Blanche of Navarre was only one of many who stood within that machinery. Her fate weighed not in her deeds or her words, but in the absurd rituals that claimed to read truth from flesh and water. If the sieve and urine tests seem bizarre to modern eyes, the fumigation and magnet trials wander even further into the territory of the occult, strange rituals born from a world where medicine and magic were not enemies but siblings intertwined and inseparable. One such practice, described by the 15th century Italian physician Niccolo Falcucci, instructed examiners to place a cloth over a woman's body and then fumigate her with aromatic smoke. If she were a virgin, he claimed she would not perceive the odour through her mouth and nose, but if she had known a man, the scent would pass into her body and betray her. Imagine it noble women, daughters of kings and queens, standing in chambers thick with smoke, their lungs burning, while midwives and physicians peered at them like alchemists searching for signs in fire. Their purity was judged not by virtue or truth, but by whether their noses twitched at the stench of burning coal. Other methods leaned on the invisible pull of magnets. A 14th century chronicler, John of Trevisa, described how a magnet placed under the pillow of a faithful wife would compel her to embrace her husband with sudden affection, while an unfaithful woman would recoil in terror, struck by visions or restless dreams. Such tests blurred the line between superstition and sorcery, pulling marriage into the realm of alchemy, as though the mysteries of loyalty and purity could be revealed by a stone that drew iron to itself. To medieval minds, there was no absurdity in these rituals. The world was a tapestry of unseen forces, angels, demons, humours, vapours, stars that pressed invisibly upon human flesh. Physicians studied astrology alongside anatomy, believing that Mars could inflame the blood as surely as a fever, or that Venus might loosen the womb. Alchemists claimed metals transformed by secret laws. Why should not the women's bodies obey similar hidden rules? If lead could be coaxed toward gold, perhaps chastity too could be transmuted. Its presence or absence, revealed through smoke or magnetism. The women subjected to such tests knew they were theatre. They must have sensed as they coughed beneath fumes or lay rigid on a bed with a stone beneath the pillow that their judges were not truly seeking truth but rather affirmation of suspicion. Yet defiance was dangerous. To protest the absurdity of the test was to appear guilty. To endure it silently was to be complicit in one's own degradation. Behind the rituals lay fear. Kings, priests and physicians all dreaded uncertainty. They needed ways to disguise their anxiety in the cloak of procedure. Fumigation and magnet tests, as illogical as they seem now, gave an aura of control in a world terrified of deception. They were ceremonies that reassured rulers they had done everything possible to guard their dynasties against false heirs. But what these practices truly revealed was not purity or guilt, it was the medieval mind itself. A mind that believed the invisible was as real as the visible, that unseen vapours could carry truth, that stones could reveal secrets of the soul. In that twilight world between faith and science medicine, and magic blurred into one, and women's bodies became the canvas upon which those fears and fantasies were inscribed. Blanche of Navarre may not have faced the smoke or the stone herself, but she lived in a culture where such ordeals were considered legitimate tools of judgment. For her, and for every queen of her age, the knowledge that such trials could be demanded at any moment was enough to keep the air heavy with drayed smoke without fire, but suffocating all the same. It might seem at first glance that the presence of women, midwives, matrons, ladies of the court would have softened the brutality of virginity examinations. After all, who better to understand the vulnerability of another woman than one who had endured the same fears and indignities herself? And yet the paradox of the Middle Ages was that it was often women who enforced the rules that oppressed their sisters. Midwives in particular stood at the centre of this paradox. In peasant villages they were lifelines delivering babies, tending to mothers, holding knowledge of herbs and remedies passed down through generations. They were keepers of fragile lives in a world where childbirth often meant death. But in royal courts, midwives' skills were twisted into something far darker. Their authority over women's bodies made them convenient instruments for a system determined to regulate those bodies in service of power. When Blanche of Navarre lay trembling in that stone chamber, it was not men who touched her, but women. Their hands were rough with years of catching infants, but their words carried the weight of kings. They were tasked with pronouncing judgment intact or defiled virgin or fraud. In that moment their sisterhood was severed by loyalty to a higher master, the court that paid them the king who relied on their verdict, the church that sanctified their authority. Why did women betray one another so readily? The answer lies partly in survival. In a patriarchal world, midwives had carved out a narrow but significant sphere of influence. They were respected, feared, sometimes even accused of witchcraft for their secret knowledge. By serving the interests of kings and priests, they safeguarded their position. To resist to show compassion at the expense of truth was to risk losing not only their livelihood, but their very lives. A midwife who contradicted the will of the court could be branded a liar, stripped of honour or burned as a witch. Better then to betray a fellow woman than to stand against the machinery of power. And yet the story was not always so simple. Records whisper of midwives who lied deliberately to protect a queen, who swore before God and king that a woman was untouched though they knew otherwise. Acts of quiet rebellion, small flickers of solidarity existed in the shadows, but such defiance was rare and dangerous. More often the women who should have been allies became the very hands that enforced humiliation. The ambiguity of their role reflected the ambiguity of medieval womanhood itself. Midwives had knowledge, but no authority of their own. They were indispensable yet despised. They were respected as healers, yet suspected as witches. By serving as examiners of virginity, they anchored themselves to the structures that ruled over them, becoming both victims and collaborators in the cycle of control. For Blanche, the betrayal must have been particularly sharp. To be examined by men would have been degrading enough, but to endure the intrusion of women who might have been mothers themselves, women who should have understood, was its own cruelty. Their silence, their cold professionalism reminded her that no bond of shared suffering could survive the weight of political necessity. In this way, midwives embodied the tragic contradiction of medieval society. Women used to subjugate women, mothers enlisted to police daughters, sisters turned into judges. Their hands caught the first cries of life, yet those same hands could stem a queen to ruin. They were healers and enforcers, guardians and betrayers. And so the examinations became more than a contest between men and women. They revealed a society so thoroughly steeped in patriarchal logic that women themselves became the tools of its enforcement. Blanche's humiliation was not inflicted by faceless men alone. It was delivered through the practiced fingers of women who had traded sisterhood for survival. To fail a virginity test in the medieval world was to step off a cliff with no ground below. The consequences were never light, for they reached far beyond the individual woman. A failed verdict could mean the collapse of a dynasty, the unravelling of treaties, or the humiliation of a king, and so the punishments were as severe as the fear that bred them. In Castile, a queen who failed such an ordeal could be stripped of her crown and sent into exile, her name dragged through the courts as a deceiver. A common woman might face imprisonment, branding, or the slow death of starvation at the edge of society. But in many cases, disgrace was not enough. Blood was demanded to wash away dishonour. In Hungary during the 14th century, noble brides accused of impurity were sometimes publicly executed, their bodies displayed as warnings to others. Chroniclers record that in certain Italian city-states a dishonoured woman might be cast into the streets abandoned even by her family, left to beg for scrapsets, while former friends crossed themselves and whispered curses. In France, the humiliation could take on theatrical cruelty. A woman declared unchaste might be paraded through the streets, her hair shorn, her garments torn to expose her body, her shame made into spectacle. The law did not always require death, but the social sentence was often as final as execution. Once declared impure, a woman lost her value in the dynastic market. No new husband would claim her. No dowry, however large, could erase the stain. She became a ghost walking the corridors of power, alive but untouchable. These punishments were not confined to Europe. Across the world, honour was a fragile commodity, and women bore the burden of protecting it. In parts of the Islamic world, accusations of lost virginity could lead to stoning, a practice rooted not in the Quran, but in tribal codes of honour that long predated Islam. Among certain Hindu communities, women suspected of sexual impurity faced banishment from family compounds, condemned to live as outcasts or widows even while still younger. In medieval China, a concubine accused of infidelity could be strangled by decree of the household patriarch, her body quietly removed from the palace so as not to disturb the emperor's dignity. The thread binding these practices together was the idea that a woman's body was not hers alone, but the vessel of her family's, even her nation's reputation. To fail a test was not seen as a private matter of love or betrayal, but as a public crime, a stain that demanded erasure. In this, the so-called justice of Europe resembled the honour killings that still scar parts of the world today. Different cultures, different rituals, but the same cruel logic: the death of the woman restores the honour of the men. For queens like Blanche of Navarre, the stakes were sharper still. A failed examination could ignite wars. If Blanche had been declared spoiled, her marriage contract with Castile would have unravelled, and her dowry, lands and alliances returned to Navarre in disgrace. Foreign courts would whisper that she was a liar, her family cheats. Rival kings might seize on the opportunity to contest Castile's legitimacy. Entire regions could be thrown into turmoil all because of the verdict on one woman's body. It is chilling to imagine the weight Blanche carried as she stepped into that chamber. She knew what failure meant. Not just shame for herself, but dishonour for her father, instability for her homeland, and potential bloodshed across borders. The judgment of a few midwives could ripple outward, until armies marched and kingdoms fell. To fail was to lose everything. To pass was only to postpone the judgment until the next test, the next suspicion, the next moment when men decided that proof was required again. It was a game without end, and the cost of losing was ruin. Thus the punishments for failure were not merely penalties for individuals. They were instruments of control, reminders etched in blood and exile that no woman could escape the reach of the system. Blanche's trembling in that stone chamber was not only fear for herself, it was fear for the avalanche her body could unleash if judged unworthy. If Blanche of Navarre's ordeal revealed how virginity could determine a queen's personal fate, the case of Catherine of Aragon proved that it could alter the course of an entire kingdom. Her battle with Henry VIII over the question of her untouched state did not simply decide the future of their marriage. It fractured England from the Catholic Church, redefined monarchy itself, and set in motion the English Reformation. Catherine, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon, and Isabella of Castile arrived in England as a teenage bride meant to unite two powerful kingdoms. She first wed Prince Arthur, Henry's older brother. Their marriage was brief. Arthur died months later at the age of 15. Catherine swore before God and man that their union had never been consummated. Her body, she insisted, was still virginal. That insistence mattered because years later she married Arthur's younger brother Henry. For a time all seemed well. Catherine bore children, though most died in infancy, and she served as a popular queen, respected for her piety, intelligence and dignity. But as the years wore on, Catherine produced only one surviving child, Mary. Henry, desperate for a male heir, began to view her not as the Spanish princess who had brought honour to England, but as the obstacle to his dynasty, and so he turned his eyes toward annulment. The king's argument was cunningly theological. Leviticus declared that a man who took his brother's wife would be cursed with childlessness. Henry seized upon this verse as proof that his marriage to Catherine had offended divine law. If Catherine had consummated her marriage to Arthur, then her union with Henry was incestuous in God's eyes, and their lack of sons was divine punishment. But if she had come to Henry untouched, then the marriage was valid, the curse irrelevant, and Henry had no grounds to leave her. Everything turned then on a bedchamber from decades earlier. Did Catherine lie with Arthur? Did their marriage ever cross the threshold of consummation? The question haunted Europe for years as courts of law and theology tore into the most private hours of a dead boy and a grieving girl. Catherine stood firm. To her dying day she insisted that she had come to Henry's bed a virgin. She spoke with unwavering dignity, even as theologians, politicians and ambassadors dissected her words. She became a defendant in a trial that stretched across the continent, her honour weighed against Henry's desire for a son and Anne Boleyn's allure at court. The spectacle was breathtaking in its cruelty. Learned men in scarlet robes debated whether Catherine's body had once known her first husband. They treated her as though she were a specimen, her truth, something to be poked and prodded in legal argument. Her reputation, her very soul, was forced into the marketplace of politics where her word was pitted against the king's ambition. In reality, Henry's case was less about scripture than about sovereignty. The Pope hesitated to grant him an annulment partly because of Catherine's powerful Spanish relatives. Henry bristled at the delay, resenting that a foreign bishop could dictate the fate of England's crown. And so the question of Catherine's virginity became the lever with which he pried England out of Rome's grasp. The irony was cruel. Catherine, who had spent her life defending her untouched state, who had endured humiliations to preserve her honour, became the very reason her husband broke with the church. Her body, declared pure at one marriage and contested at another, became the battlefield on which the Reformation began. When Henry finally cast her aside, declaring his marriage invalid, Catherine remained unyielding. From exile, she signed her letters as Queen of England, refusing to accept the shame he tried to impose. She went to her grave insisting that she was innocent, that her honour had never been stained, and that her daughter Mary was the rightful heir. The echoes of that battle resound still. The Reformation was not only a clash of theology and power, it was also a reminder of how a queen's body could alter history. Catherine's chastity, real or imagined, was dissected in courts and pulpits, and in the process it cracked the foundations of Christendom. For in the end it was not simply a question of love or betrayal. It was proof that in the medieval and early modern world a woman's virginity was never hers alone. It belonged to kings, to kingdoms, to the very church itself. And when that question was put to Catherine of Aragon, the answer redrew the map of Europe. Few figures in history embody the paradox of purity and power as vividly as Joan of Arc. She was no queen, no princess, bound in dynastic marriage, but a peasant girl who rose to command armies and change the course of the 100 Years' War. Yet even she, armoured in faith and legend, was forced to endure the same humiliating trials of innocence that queens like Blanche of Navarre or Catherine of Aragon faced. For Joan, the question of virginity was not about dynastic inheritance, but about divine legitimacy. To her judges and her allies alike, her untouched body became the seal that authenticated her visions, her victories, and her very mission from God. When Joan first appeared at the court of Charles VII, claiming that she had been sent by heaven to deliver France from English domination, suspicion naturally followed. Was she truly God's messenger, or a fraud, a witch, a girl possessed by demons? The answer in part was sought not in her words or deeds, but in her body. Virgins, it was believed, were less vulnerable to diabolical influence. Their purity acted as a shield against corruption. If Joan were indeed intact, then perhaps her voices were divine. If not, then she was surely the devil's pawn. Thus, before she was permitted to ride at the head of armies, before she was allowed to don armour, and bannered, Joan was led into private chambers to be examined. Noble ladies and midwives probed her body with cold precision, searching for signs of virtue. Their verdict: she was a maid untouched. With that stamp of purity, she became the Maid of Orleans, her virginity transformed into a weapon of propaganda proof that God himself had chosen France's saviour. But the irony of her fate was as bitter as it was cruel. For even after she had led French forces to lift the siege of Orleans, even after she had stood fearless in battle, even after her courage had inspired a broken nation to crown Charles at Reims, her purity was doubted again and again. When the English captured her in 1430, they too demanded proof of her chastity. She was stripped, searched and humiliated by women appointed for the task their findings reported to male judges who sought to discredit her. The spectacle was grotesque, a girl who had faced swords and arrows without fear now forced to lie naked, while noble women inspected her genitals for evidence of sanctity. Her military triumphs meant nothing beside the fragile tissue that men insisted defined her worth. At her trial in Rouen, theologians circled her like vultures, twisting her testimony, seeking to trap her in contradictions. And always beneath the charges of heresy, witchcraft and false visions lay the question of her virginity. For if she was no virgin, then she was no maid, and if she was no maid, then she could not possibly have been chosen by heaven. Joan knew this. In her testimony she declared that she had vowed her body to God, that she had kept her virginity for him alone. She spoke of it as a covenant, a pledge that sealed her bond with the divine. To her, chastity was not a political tool but a spiritual vow. Yet her judges twisted that vow into a chain, a way to bind and control her. The irony deepened at the end. When the English placed her in a prison cell, they dressed her in men's clothing, then used her cross-dressing as the evidence of sin. When they condemned her to death by fire, her virginity no longer mattered. Whether intact or not, she was to be destroyed. And yet even in death, the legend of her purity endured, for France remembered her not as a heretic, but as the maid untainted faithful, a virgin martyr whose ashes could not tarnish her name. The symbolism was immense. In a world that tied sanctity to untouched flesh, Joan became the ultimate paradox, a warrior whose authority rested not only on her victories but on her chastity. She was proof that in the medieval mind, even holiness required verification, that divine voices could not be trusted unless authenticated by the hands of midwives. Her humiliation lingers as one of history's bitterest ironies. A peasant girl who raised armies, defied kings and changed the fate of nations, was reduced again and again to a body examined by strangers. Her courage on the battlefield could never outweigh the obsession with what she had not done in bed, and yet the very tests meant to degrade her only amplified her legend. By proving her untouched, they gave France the maid it needed, a symbol of innocence leading a wounded kingdom toward hope. Joan's virginity was never her own, but it became a banner under which thousands rallied. In the end, her body was consumed by fire, but her name burned brighter still, the virgin, the warrior, the martyr. If virginity's tests in stone chambers were one ordeal, the wedding night was another, and in many ways more brutal. For noble brides across medieval Europe, the most intimate moment of their lives was never truly private. It was a performance, a trial in which their bodies were expected to produce proof of purity written in blood on white sheets. The symbolism was stark. On the morning after the wedding, servants would hurry to the bridal chamber, stripping the bed of its linens and carrying them out for inspection. Blood stains, whether genuine or contrived, were displayed as evidence of consummation and chastity preserved until marriage. In some courts, these sheets were paraded before guests held up like trophies. In others, they were quietly stored away in archives, relics of virtue to be presented in disputes or annulment trials. For the bride, this expectation turned the night into a crucible of terror. The first sexual experience, already fraught with pain and fear, was overshadowed by the knowledge that failure to bleed could mean ruin. Some women prayed desperately that their bodies would conform to expectation. Others devised tricks to ensure that the telltale stains appeared no matter what happened. A vial of chicken blood hidden beneath the sheets, a carefully timed menstruation, even deliberate self-inflicted wounds, all desperate strategies to escape the doom of a spotless cloth. The groom too was caught in the snare. His masculinity was measured not only by his ability to perform, but by his ability to draw blood, as though conquest in the bedroom mirrored conquest on the battlefield. For some men, the pressure to produce results led to violence, turning what should have been a tender encounter into an act of brutality. For others, shame awaited if the sheets failed to show the expected stains their manhood questioned before the eyes of family and court. These rituals were not confined to Europe. In Armenia, the display of blood was known as the red apple, a symbol of honour. In parts of Georgia and Azerbaijan, wedding celebrations sometimes included a public announcement of the bride's virginity confirmed by the presence of blood. Among certain Middle Eastern traditions, sheets or garments marked with stains were presented to elders as tokens of proof. Even in South Asia, echoes of these customs endured, with communities demanding evidence of a bride's purity before accepting her fully into her husband's household. Everywhere, the logic was the same: blood equaled honour. The absence of blood equaled disgrace. That it was biologically unreliable that many women do not bleed upon first intercourse, or that a hymen may tear long before, was ignored. What mattered was the theatre, the performance of purity. The psychological toll was immense. Brides entered their wedding chambers not with anticipation but with dread, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that their entire lives balanced on the stains of a sheet. The night that should have been a beginning instead became an ordeal. Some women emerged traumatized, associating intimacy forever with fear. Others withdrew inward, their bodies no longer vessels of desire, but instruments of proof, subject to inspection by family servants and courtiers. And yet for some, the ordeal was not only endured, but weaponized. Queens and noblewomen learned that bloody sheets could silence enemies, settle disputes, and fortify alliances. They became perversely a form of protection evidence that could be called upon years later when marriages were questioned. In this way, the bed itself became an extension of the courtroom, its linens the parchment upon which legitimacy was written. But behind every stain lay pain. Physical pain, yes, the tearing of flesh, the sting of expectation, but also the deeper wound of being reduced to proof. For men and women alike, the wedding bed was less a place of love than a stage where bodies played out the anxieties of kingdoms. Blanche of Navarre, Catherine of Aragon, Joan of Arc each endured examinations in chambers of stone, but countless others unnamed and forgotten endured their trials between sheets, their blood turned into currency, their pain into spectacle. And in every palace across Europe and beyond, the question was the same: did the bed tell the story of purity preserved? If it did, the marriage was secure. If it did not, disaster lurked. Thus, the most private act of human intimacy became one of the most public tests of power. Where terror thrives, so too does ingenuity. Faced with the impossible demands of virginity tests and the terrifying weight of the wedding bed, many medieval women turned to desperate deceptions. Their methods, often cruel to their own bodies, reveal both the suffocating pressure they lived under and the courage with which they sought to survive. The most infamous instructions appear in the Trotula, a 12th century compendium of women's medicine from Salerno. Hidden within its pages are recipes for deceit guides for women who feared exposure on their wedding nights. One suggestion was chilling a plier leech carefully to the labia so that it would draw blood, leaving a small wound that could bleed anew during consummation. The pain must have been excruciating, the risk of infection real, but compared to disgrace it was a small price. Others turned to far simpler but equally grim strategies. Chicken blood, easily available in households where animals were butchered daily, could be smuggled into the bridal chamber in small vials or concealed within jewellery. At the right moment it could be spilled onto the sheets, producing the crimson proof that everyone expected to see. Some texts even advised young women to time their weddings to coincide with menstruation, disguising natural blood as the sign of purity. In some tales, entire substitutions took place. There are whispers in chronicles and romances of stand-in bridesmaids, or even sisters secretly taking the place of the real bride on the wedding night, ensuring blood was produced and honour preserved. Such deception required daring coordination, complicity from attendants, and extraordinary risk. Exposure meant not only ruin, but execution for fraud. And yet the stories endure because the stakes were so high that even this unthinkable gamble seemed preferable to failure. Other manuals advise concoctions of herbs and eggs inserted into the body to create a swelling and tightness that might mimic the signs of virginity. One recipe recommended the whites of eggs mixed with pennyroyal water soaked into linen and placed inside the vagina to give the illusion of constriction. These remedies were dangerous, sometimes toxic, but they were attempts at survival in a world that demanded proof of the impossible. Behind each trick lay terror. To be discovered was worse than to fail outright. A woman caught bleeding from a leech or with hidden vials of blood would be branded not only unchaste but deceitful and unforgivable crime that invited harsher punishment. Yet many risked it anyway because the alternative was annihilation, exile, death, or a lifetime of disgrace. And yet there is also a strange kind of courage in these acts. These women trapped in a system that reduced them to symbols found ways to reclaim agency, however small, however desperate. They used knowledge of their bodies, access to household tools, and the complicity of trusted attendants to outwit kings, priests, and physicians. Their deceptions were not mere lies, they were acts of rebellion against a world determined to destroy them. Still, the victories were always precarious. A stained sheet might silence gossip for a night, but suspicion lingered. The threat of renewed testing never disappeared. The ingenuity of women bought them time, sometimes years, sometimes only days. The terror of discovery shadowed them always. Blanche of Navarre never had to resort to such tricks. Her untouched body was both her curse and her shield, but countless others less fortunate relied on desperate measures to survive the scrutiny of marriage and court. Their stories remind us that beneath the records of kings and theologians lies another history, one of hidden courage, whispered secrets, and blood that was not always what it seemed. In the shadowed corridors of medieval life, deception was not villainy. It was survival. The cold rooms of power. The chambers where virginity examinations took place were designed to inspire dread. They were rarely bedrooms or places of comfort, but austere spaces, more akin to courtrooms or prisons. Cold stone walls, narrow windows, and minimal furnishing created an atmosphere of judgment, not intimacy. The air itself seemed heavy, as though it conspired with the examiners to weigh upon the women summoned there. The setup was deliberate. In some palaces, examination rooms were located near chapels, so that the scrutiny of a woman's flesh seemed an extension of divine authority. In others, they were placed adjacent to council chambers, emphasizing that these ordeals were political events as much as personal humiliations. A woman stripped bare on a wooden table was not simply a bride or queen, she was evidence, a living document presented before witnesses. The witnesses themselves varied, but they were always present. Noble ladies and midwives performed the examinations while courtiers, clerics, or appointed matrons looked on. Their presence served two purposes: to ensure that no fraud could occur and to magnify the humiliation. For what could be more degrading than baring one's most private parts not to a physician in confidence, but to a jury of peers and strangers, some of whom might later whisper the details in courtly corridors? The instruments of this science were as crude as they were invasive. Midwives used fingers, sometimes wooden or metal probes, to search for signs of penetration. Physicians claimed to measure the tightness of the vaginal canal or to inspect the hymen with candles and mirrors. These tools had no medical legitimacy, they were instruments of violation masquerading as science. A hymen could tear in childhood from climbing, riding, or labour, but in the cold rooms of power, such explanations held no weight. Flesh was treated as evidence, and evidence was twisted to fit political needs. The atmosphere in these rooms carried the same logic as inquisitorial chambers. Just as suspected heretics were bound and questioned under threat of torture, so too were women's bodies bound to the logic of examination. In both cases, the body became the battlefield where truth was supposedly revealed, whether by the rack or by the probing hand. Pain was not incidental, it was central. It produced submission, reinforced authority, and transformed the victim into a specimen. And like the Inquisition, the process cloaked itself in ritual. Examiners prayed before beginning as though God himself sanctioned their hands. Clerks recorded their findings in clinical Latin, stripping away the humanity of the woman until she was reduced to a list of observations, the membrane intact, the passage narrow, the flesh soft. These notes would be filed away, carried into courts, or preserved in archives so that the humiliation lived on in ink long after the body healed. The women subjected to these ordeals endured more than physical violation. They endured the crushing sense of being watched from all sides of every breath and flinch catalogued of their bodies transformed into public property. The silence of the chamber was broken only by commands: "Be still, do not move, let her be examined." It was the language of surveillance, the stripping of agency, until the woman ceased to be a person and became a case. Blanche of Navarre felt it when she stood trembling beneath the gaze of the Duchess of Bedford. Joan of Arc felt it when noble women poured at her searching for proof that her voices were not the devil's lies. Catherine of Aragon felt it when theologians argued over her marriage bed, as if her honour were a courtroom exhibit. In every case, the rooms were cold because they were meant to be spaces of power designed to remind women that their dignity could be set aside whenever convenient. They were not torture chambers in the sense of chains and racks, yet the similarity was unmistakable. Both sought to wring truth from flesh. Both disguised cruelty as justice, both relied on fear to maintain authority. For the women examined, the violation was not only physical but existential. To lie naked under the scrutiny of strangers was to feel the full weight of a society that claimed ownership of their very being. In the end, the cold rooms of power were not about discovering truth. They were about displaying it. They showed women what the system could do to them. They showed courtiers that purity was a matter of state enforceable by ritual humiliation. And they showed kings and priests that their authority extended into the most private crevices of human life. It was surveillance masquerading as science cruelty disguised as order. And the women who endured it carried scars that no document recorded, but that lived in the silence of their memories long after the chamber doors had closed. Records that never died. The examinations themselves were degrading enough, but the indignity did not end when the women left the chamber. What had been forced upon their bodies was preserved in ink, clinical, detached and permanent. Court scribes, men trained to record every word and gesture of political importance, were summoned to document the ordeal. Their pens scratched across parchment as if they were noting trade contracts or the terms of a treaty, yet what they captured were the most private humiliations of queens and maidens. A report might read, her hymen appeared intact, the passage was narrow, the matrons declare her untouched, or more damningly, the membrane showed rupture. The evidence of chastity is absent. The language was cold, impersonal, stripped of humanity. The woman herself vanished behind phrases of anatomy and judgment transformed from a person into a legal artifact. These records were not meant to vanish into obscurity. They were stored in archives, sometimes copied and sent abroad, and often revisited years later in disputes over inheritance or annulments. When Henry VIII sought to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, scholars and priests pored over the question of whether she had consummated her union with Arthur. They did not simply rely on testimony, they scoured older documents, medical notes and testimonies taken decades earlier, searching for textual proof of her purity or guilt. Catherine's body, long since aged, was forced to stand trial again through ink on parchment. The same was true of Joan of Arc. At Rouen, records were meticulously kept of every word she spoke, every test she endured. Her virginity examinations were noted in detail, and those notes became part of her trial transcript. When she was condemned to the flames, it was not only her body that was consumed. Her recorded humiliation lived on bound into legal volumes that would later be read by scholars, priests, and eventually by historians. Why such a pathetic obsession with the written record? In part it was diplomacy. A stained or unblemished reputation could decide the fate of alliances. If a queen were declared pure, ambassadors might carry the documentation to foreign courts as proof of honour, ensuring that treaties held firm. If she were condemned, the records became weapons ammunition for annulments or wars. Theology too demanded permanence. The Church framed these examinations as spiritual judgments as well as physical ones. To prove virginity was to prove sanctity. To fail was to confirm sin. Records of examinations thus entered the machinery of canon law, cited by theologians in arguments about marriage legitimacy and divine favour. What should have been private suffering became public precedent. For later historians, these documents are both priceless and harrowing. They offer a window into the intimate realities of medieval power, how politics intruded upon the flesh, how bodies were turned into evidence, how humiliation was not only endured but archived. Yet they also remind us of the cruelty of preservation. A queen might endure a single examination in her lifetime, but the record of it ensured that her body would be examined again and again by generations who never knew her. In this way, the records never died. They travelled across courts, resurfaced in disputes, and outlived the women themselves. They show us how ink can be as violating as touch, how the pen can strip dignity as surely as probing hands. The women of those cold rooms were not only examined once, they were immortalised in parchment, their most private shame transformed into history's property. Blanche of Navarre. Catherine of Aragon, Joan of Arc, each of them remains bound to us through these documents, their voices silenced, their bodies reduced to evidence. The records that never died ensure that their humiliation echoes through the centuries, preserved not by memory, but by bureaucracy, as if history itself conspired to ensure they could never escape the ordeal. Politics in the flesh. In the late medieval and early modern world, the female body was more than a vessel for life. It was a ledger for treaties, a bargaining chip in international negotiations, and sometimes the spark that set kingdoms ablaze. Virginity was never simply a private matter of honour, it was international diplomacy written in flesh and sealed in blood. When a princess crossed borders to marry, she carried with her more than silks and dowries. She carried the fragile expectation of purity, an expectation that if shattered, could unravel alliances worth more than armies. A dowry could secure lands, a treaty could guarantee peace, but only an unbroken hymen could assure that the children born of the union would be beyond question. Without that certainty, no contract was safe. Blanche of Navarre's ordeal reflected this reality. Her examination was not only about her own honour, it was about the alliance between Navarre and Castile. If she had failed, her dowry would have been forfeit, her marriage void, and two kingdoms thrust into dispute. The verdict of two midwives and the Duchess of Bedford held the weight of international stability. History offers other, even starker examples. In 1308, Isabella of France, later infamous as the She-Wolf of France, married Edward II of England. Her dowry included vast tracts of land and promises of peace between two rival kingdoms. Yet years later, when Edward's reign faltered and enemies sought to discredit him, rumours swirled not only about his favourites at court, but about Isabella's chastity. Whispered accusations that she had betrayed her vows became political weapons used to weaken her position and justify rebellion. In 1499, Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, was forced into a public annulment from her husband, Giovanni Sforza. The grounds non-consummation. Lucrezia's virginity, or rather her supposed lack of it, became a tool for the Borgias to sever an alliance that no longer suited them. Court records declared that she was still untouched, conveniently preserving her honour while freeing her to be remarried for greater political advantage. Her body once again became the battlefield where papal strategy was fought. Even wars could ignite from such questions. In 1589, the annulment of Henry VIII's daughter, Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland from her second husband Archibald Douglas, plunged Scottish politics into chaos. Questions of her chastity and her marriage's legitimacy gave fuel to rival factions, destabilising the fragile peace between Scotland and England. The stakes of virginity extended beyond Europe as well. In the Byzantine Empire, marriage alliances with foreign rulers required elaborate negotiations of purity. A Byzantine princess sent to Russia or Armenia had to arrive untouched, her hymen as vital a guarantee as the dowry of gold she carried. If suspicion arose, the alliance could collapse before the wedding feast ended, sometimes leading to armed retaliation for perceived insult. The language of treaties reflects this obsession. Contracts between dynasties frequently included clauses ensuring the untainted state of the bride. A failure to prove it could mean the return of her dowry, the nullification of the marriage, or, in extreme cases, open conflict between families. A woman's body was the contract, her blood the seal. What is most striking is how political convenience often decided the verdict. If an alliance was desirable, examiners found a way to declare the bride pure no matter the truth. If a union became inconvenient, suddenly doubts arose, tests were demanded, and accusations surfaced. Virginity was less about biology than about leverage. Catherine of Aragon's case made this brutally clear. When Henry VIII wanted her, she was deemed untouched. When he sought to cast her aside, her past was reinterpreted as evidence of sin. For the women themselves, this reality meant that their bodies were never secure. At any moment their worth could be re-evaluated. Their purity questioned their marriages unmade. To be born noble was to be born into a life where every step was shadowed by the possibility that one's flesh might be summoned as evidence in the great theatre of politics. Virginity was diplomacy, annulment was strategy, and suspicion was war. And in every case the lives of women were the battlefield. Weapons of control. Virginity tests were never only about proof. They were weapons, carefully sharpened instruments of psychological warfare wielded against women of every rank. By holding the threat of inspection over their heads, courts and kings ensured obedient submission and silence. The power of the tests lay not only in their humiliating rituals, but in the fear they cultivated, a fear that shaped how women moved, thought, and even inhabited their own bodies. Every noble girl grew up with the knowledge that her body was not her own. From childhood she heard whispers of failed brides, of discarded queens, of bloodless sheets that ruined marriages. She learned that her worth was fragile, that one false rumour could undo her future. This knowledge bred vigilance. Girls avoided strenuous activities, riding, climbing, dancing too vigorously for fear they might damage the delicate hymen that stood as guarantor of their honour. Some walked through life as though their bodies were glass, careful never to risk suspicion. The threat of examination was often enough to enforce compliance. A woman did not need to be stripped and inspected to feel the cold hand of power. She only needed to know that such a fate could come at any time. In this way, virginity's testing resembled the machinery of the Inquisition. It was not necessary to torture everyone for the system to function. The mere knowledge that torture existed kept the population obedient. So too with women, the possibility of being summoned to a cold chamber was enough to keep them pliant. Marriage itself became an act of surveillance. A bride approached her wedding bed as though entering a courtroom, knowing her performance would be judged not by love, but by evidence. The ritual of bloody sheets was less about truth than about ensuring that women internalized their role to provide proof, to display obedience, to offer up their bodies as state documents. Even in intimacy, fear ruled. This fear bled into every corner of life. Women monitored their own speech, careful never to hint at impropriety. They kept close watch on their bodies, avoiding any situation that might invite suspicion. They learned to be silent when gossips whispered, to accept humiliation when midwives prodded, to bow their heads when clerks recorded their shame. The system did not only control their actions, it colonized their thoughts, and so obedience became ritualized. A queen who submitted quietly to examination signalled loyalty to her husband's dynasty. A bride who bled on command signalled her family's honour. Even resistance often took the form of calculated performance, smuggled chicken blood, feigned innocence, carefully staged deception. Women became actresses in a play written by men, a play that demanded they embody purity, whether true or false. The cruelty of virginity tests was that they turned women against themselves. They learned to distrust their own bodies, to see their flesh not as a source of strength or joy, but as a potential liability. A torn hymen from climbing a horse, an absence of blood on a wedding sheet, any accident could be mistaken for sin. In this way, oppression was internalized. Women became their own jailers, guarding their movements, censoring their desires, doubting their worth. Kings and priests understood the value of this system. It was cheaper and easier than armies. Why wage war against women when you could train them to police themselves? Why silence them with threats when you could make them silence themselves out of fear? The examinations were public enough to send a message, private enough to seem inevitable, and humiliating enough to leave lasting scars. For Blanche of Navarre, Catherine of Aragon, Joan of Arc and countless others, virginity tests were not single events. They were lifelong shadows. The fear of being summoned, the memory of being probed, the knowledge that their most intimate truths could be questioned at any time, these were chains stronger than iron. Thus, virginity tests were not simply about confirming purity. They were about ensuring control. They reminded every woman from queen to peasant that her body was never truly hers. It belonged to her father, her husband, her king, her god, and could be summoned, inspected, and judged whenever power demanded it. In this way, a piece of flesh became an empire's leash, resistance and survival. For every cold chamber and humiliating verdict, there were whispers in the shadows. Women, though bound by silence in public, found ways to share knowledge in kitchens and gardens, in the hidden corners of palaces. They passed along recipes from the trotula, warned daughters of what to expect, and counselled brides on tricks to survive the ordeal of the wedding bed. These networks were fragile, clandestine, and easily crushed if exposed, yet they existed, and they reveal a quiet resistance threaded through the fabric of patriarchal control. One woman might teach another how to time her marriage, during her bleeding days, disguising menstrual blood as the proof demanded by in-laws. Another might whisper the method of hiding chicken blood in a small vial, slipped into a sleeve or sewn into a hem. Midwives themselves, though often instruments of power, could sometimes betray the system by testifying in a girl's favour, knowing full well she was not untouched. A nod, a lie told with a steady voice could save a life. Such acts were not grand rebellions, but small precise fractures in the machine of oppression. They were proto-feminist gestures of solidarity, moments when women chose to protect one another instead of serving the cruel expectations of kings and priests. And though they could not topple the system they cracked, it reminded it that its power was never absolute. In village settings, these practices were even more direct. Mothers taught daughters how to mix herbal poultices to tighten the body before a wedding. Some women used vinegar rinses, others mixtures of alum eggs or resin, dangerous and sometimes harmful, but proof of the ingenuity driven by desperation. The remedies may not have been safe, but they were attempts at agency born of the conviction that survival was worth the risk. Stories also spread of women who refused entirely. Chronicles whisper of noble brides who entered the wedding chamber with quiet defiance, announcing their worth, regardless of blood or sheet. They were rare, often punished, but their courage carved a path for others to imagine resistance. Even the choice not to weep during an examination could be its own rebellion, a refusal to grant the system the satisfaction of visible despair. And then there was solidarity across class. A servant might help her mistress by distracting watchful eyes, while a vial was emptied on the sheets. A nurse might intervene during an examination, gently guiding the midwife's hands away from revealing too much. These hidden alliances demonstrate that resistance was never an individual act, but a communal one, sustained by whispers, courage and trust. We might call these women deceivers, but to do so would miss the truth they were survivors. They understood that their bodies were political currency and that survival required bending rules, playing roles, even wounding themselves to fit an impossible mould. Their deception was not betrayal of morality, but defiance of injustice. And though the system endured for centuries, such cracks mattered. Every false sheet displayed to a court, every leech bite mistaken for virgin proof, every midwife's merciful lie weakened the illusion that male authority was infallible. The patriarchal machine required women's full complicity to function. The moment even a few refused to obey completely, it revealed the fragility of the entire structure. Blanche of Navarre's untouched body, Catherine of Aragon's dignified defiance, Joan of Arc's unbroken vow, these were one kind of survival. But the secret bloodstains, the whispered recipes, the hidden alliances of women, that was another. Both forms of endurance testify to a truth the courts refused to admit. Women were never simply passive victims. Even in the coldest chambers of power, they found ways to resist, to help each other, and to endure. And in those small acts of survival lay the beginnings of something larger, a proto-feminist consciousness, a recognition that their suffering was shared, and that solidarity, however quiet, could be the strongest weapon of all, the Church's contradiction. The medieval Church taught that the human body was a temple of the Holy Spirit, a vessel meant to be treated with reverence. From pulpits, priests preached that every soul bore the image of God, and that women no less than men were precious in his sight. Yet in the cold reality of power, the same Church sanctioned examinations that reduced women to objects of evidence. Theology spoke of dignity, practice demanded exposure. It was a contradiction so vast that it split Christian doctrine against itself. Nowhere was this tension clearer than in the cult of virgin martyrs. Saints like Agnes, Cecilia and Lucy were exalted precisely because they had resisted the violation of their bodies. Hagiographies lingered on their chastity, like a jewel Agnes who chose death over marriage, Cecilia who vowed her purities to God and converted her husband, Lucy who plucked out her own eyes to preserve her vow. The Church held these women up as models of incorruptible holiness, living proof that the untouched body could reflect divine will. And yet while saints were celebrated for guarding their virginity living, women were dragged into chambers and ordered to prove it under human hands. The hymen became less a symbol of devotion than a piece of evidence to be verified by midwives, noted by clerks and wielded in courts of kings. The same bishops who venerated virgin saints in their sermons presided over trials that stripped women naked to search for signs of chastity. This hypocrisy was not accidental. It was rooted in this Church's obsession with purity as both a spiritual and political weapon. Virginity was framed as the highest state for women, aligning them with the Virgin Mary herself. The cult of Mary, rising to its height in the later Middle Ages, proclaimed her perpetual virginity as a sign of divine favour. Every noble woman was measured against that impossible standard. Queens and brides were expected to be little Marys, untouched, unquestioned, immaculate, until marriage sanctified their sexuality. But unlike Mary, mortal women were subject to suspicion. Their word was never enough. The Church that celebrated virginity also distrusted women so deeply that it demanded proof physical and humiliating. Virgin martyrs were revered only because their deaths made their chastity unassailable. Living women were condemned precisely because their purity could always be doubted. The contradiction deepened in theology itself. On the one hand, clerics wrote that lust was the great corrupter, that the flesh must be mortified, that purity of soul mattered more than flesh. On the other, they demanded visible bodily signs of purity, turning the body into the battlefield of salvation. Spiritual worth was measured by physical membranes, as though grace itself could be documented by anatomy. Joan of Arc's ordeal embodies this paradox with merciless clarity. The Church's theologians interrogated her visions, weighing her words for signs of heresy, yet they also insisted on verifying her virginity. They argued that only a maid could be chosen by God to save France. In the same breath, they called her a heretic and demanded midwives prove her untouched. When she was burned at the stake, the Church condemned her soul, but even then whispers about her virginity persisted, as if her ashes could still be made to testify. The obsession with virginity was at its root a way for the Church to claim authority over women's bodies. By teaching that chastity was the highest state, it elevated purity as the ultimate female virtue. By insisting on physical verification, it ensured that no woman could claim that virtue without clerical or courtly approval. It was control disguised as sanctity, oppression cloaked in piety. And yet the contradiction gnawed at the faith itself. If the body was a temple, why defile it in the name of proof? If virgin martyrs were holy for preserving their dignity, why degrade living women to secure alliances? These questions lingered unanswered, buried beneath ritual and record. The Church's contradiction reveals the heart of the system. Virginity was never truly about God, it was about power. It was a theology tailored to keep women's bodies under scrutiny, to bind queens as tightly as nuns, to make chastity not a gift freely given, but a commodity inspected, verified and owned. Thus, even as the faithful knelt before statues of the Virgin Mary, noblewomen trembled in examination chambers. The hymns exalted purity, the hands violated it. And in that bitter paradox lay the tragedy of Christian womanhood in the Middle Ages, the temple proclaimed sacred yet treated as evidence. Echoes in modern times. The obsession with virginity did not vanish with the Middle Ages. Its echoes stretch across centuries, reshaped and repurposed, but still carrying the same weight of control. Even after Europe abandoned the cold chambers of formal examinations, the cultural fixation on purity lingered, haunting queens, commoners and entire societies. Elizabeth I of England mastered this legacy. Known as the Virgin Queen, she wielded her chastity not as a burden, but as a weapon of power. By presenting herself as untouched, she transformed a liability into a political strategy. She became the bride of her nation, a woman whose purity symbolised the purity of England itself. Portraits of Elizabeth often included symbols of chastity, pearls, moons, and the sieve, that absurd medieval testing device, now turned into an emblem of divine favour. Yet even Elizabeth's careful crafting of her image reveals how deeply the expectation endured. Her virginity was never considered her own private choice. It was a matter of state, constantly debated, scrutinised and mythologized. Outside the courts of Europe, traditions of bloody sheets and wedding night proofs persisted well into modern times. In parts of the Caucasus, the Middle East and South Asia, families still demanded evidence of a bride's chastity, with stained linens displayed to relatives as validation of honour. The Armenian red apple ceremony, where proof of virginity confirmed the bride's worth, echoed medieval Europe almost word for word. In certain communities, the absence of blood could mean disgrace, violence, or even death. In some regions of Africa and Asia, so-called virginity testing is still practiced today. Girls are subjected to invasive examinations by doctors, midwives, or elders, their worth judged by the same false markers medieval physicians once invoked. South Africa, Indonesia, Afghanistan, and parts of the Middle East have all reported cases in which young women, sometimes as young as schoolchildren, are examined under the guise of protecting morality or family honour. The medical community has long discredited such practices, recognising that the hymen is no reliable indicator of sexual activity, yet superstition, like stone walls, has a way of enduring. In October 2018, the United Nations Human Rights Council, UN Women and the World Health Organization issued a joint condemnation of virginity testing, declaring it medically unnecessary, physically harmful, and a violation of human rights. The statement was clear: the practice is a form of violence, not medicine. But the very need for such a declaration reveals how stubborn the obsession remains, and even in cultures that no longer demand bloodstained sheets or formal examinations, the shadow of the old system lingers in subtler ways. Modern societies continue to attach a woman's worth to her perceived purity. The virgin bride remains an ideal in countless traditions. Rumours of promiscuity can still destroy reputations, derail careers, or shatter marriages. Music, literature, and film often portray female chastity as sacred, while men's sexual histories are rarely judged with equal severity. The persistence of these ideas shows how deep the roots of medieval practices run. Virginity tests were never only about anatomy, they were about control, about reminding women that their bodies were not entirely their own. That logic, though reshaped, survives today. Whether through cultural expectations, family pressure, or outright medical violation, women across the world still find their worth tied to the fragile fiction of purity. What began in the cold chambers of castles now unfolds in modern clinics in whispered gossip in the weight of cultural traditions. The rituals have changed, but the power dynamics have not. The hymen is still treated as a seal of honour even when science has long since proven otherwise. The echoes of Blanche of Navarre, of Catherine of Aragon, of Joan of Arc ring loudly in our time. Their examinations were meant to secure dynasties. Today's tests claim to secure morality or protect honour. But in both the outcome is the same: women's dignity is sacrificed to uphold systems of control. The UN's condemnation is a step toward ending this legacy. Yet as long as cultures equate female worth with purity, the cold rooms of power remain with us, whether built of stone in the 15th century or of social expectation in the 21st. Behind every examination, every bloody sheet, every whispered rumour of chastity or corruption, lay the silent wreckage of women's lives. The cost was not only political or physical, it was deeply psychological, carried in shame, silence, and wounds that could not be seen. The women who endured virginity tests often left the chamber changed. They walked out clothed again, but something inside them remained stripped bare. To be treated not as a soul, not even as a wife or queen, but as an object of evidence left scars that could last a lifetime. Chroniclers never wrote of these scars, they recorded only verdicts. But in the quiet spaces of memory the trauma endured. Shame was the most immediate wound. To have one's most intimate parts examined in front of strangers was to feel one's humanity erased. Some women withdrew inward, shunning intimacy, even within their marriages, unable to separate love from humiliation. Others grew distrustful of their own bodies, treating them as traitors that could be used against them. For queens like Blanche of Navarre or Catherine of Aragon, the humiliation was compounded by publicity. Their bodies were not only examined, but discussed across courts and kingdoms. Catherine in particular spent decades reliving the same questions. Was she untouched when she came to Henry? Her private life became a battlefield of pamphlets, sermons, and lawsuits. The toll of constantly defending her integrity cannot be measured in words alone. And yet the suffering did not stop with them. Trauma rippled outward, passing into marriages, families, even future generations. A queen humiliated in examination often grew fearful and overprotective of her daughters, teaching them caution to the point of paranoia. A mother who bled from self-inflicted wounds to prove her purity might raise a child who learned early that pain was the price of survival. Fear was inherited as surely as land or titles. The psychological scars are not confined to history. Survivors of modern virginity testing describe eerily similar experiences: feelings of violation, mistrust of doctors, difficulty with intimacy, and a lifelong sense of being reduced to a body, not a person. A young woman examined in Indonesia in recent years recalled feeling like an animal, her self-worth shattered by strangers who claimed authority over her body. Another tested in Afghanistan spoke of carrying shame so deep that she could no longer meet her family's eyes, though she had done nothing wrong. These testimonies echo across centuries. Joan of Arc's humiliation, recorded in the 15th century, is mirrored in the voices of 21st century girls. The tools may have changed, but the impact is the same: the disconnection from one's own body, the inability to reconcile dignity with intrusion. Intimacy often bore the deepest wounds. Marriage, which should have offered safety instead, became shadowed by suspicion. Husbands taught to measure worth by purity sometimes joined in the scrutiny, demanding proof again and again. For women, the act of sex already tied to pain by expectation of blood became entangled with dread. Love was no shield against the memory of the examination tables and cold fingers. And then there was the silence. Few dared to speak of their trauma, for to do so was to risk more shame. A failed test could lead to exile, but even a successful one left women marked, their privacy stolen. Better to endure quietly than to protest loudly. Thus the scars became invisible, buried beneath years of stillness passed from one generation of women to the next. Modern psychology gives us the language medieval women lacked. Today we can call it trauma violation PTSD, but they felt it all the same: disconnection, anxiety, fear, the sense of being watched even when alone. The examination chambers may have been left behind, but the human cost of those rituals endures in memory and culture and the expectations that still cling to women's bodies. The true cruelty of virginity's testing was not simply that it humiliated women in their own time, it was that it robbed them of peace across their lives and sometimes across generations. It taught daughters to fear what had been done to their mothers, and granddaughters to bear the weight of shame that had never been theirs. This is the legacy of the human cost. An inheritance of silence, a scar carried not on skin but in spirit, passed down as quietly and inexorably as bloodlines themselves. Legacy of courage. Blanche of Navarre, Catherine of Aragon, Joan of Arc, three women separated by rank, by purpose, by destiny, yet bound together by the same iron grip of a world that sought to measure their worth through the narrowest of lenses. Each of them endured examinations meant to strip away not only their privacy, but their very humanity. And yet each in her own way resisted, survived, and left behind a story that continues to speak centuries later. Blanche, trembling in the cold stone chamber of 1453, endured the probing hands and the hawk-like gaze of the Duchess of Bedford. She emerged declared intact, her purity preserved, her body authenticated, but that survival was not victory. It was defiance by endurance, the quiet courage of a woman who had been condemned to 13 years of silence in a marriage without touch, yet still stood upright when her body became the stage upon which two kingdoms balanced. Catherine, questioned by kings, theologians, and papal courts, refused to yield. For decades she defended her honour with unwavering dignity, insisting to her dying breath that she had come to Henry's bed a virgin. In a world where her body became a weapon of international politics, she stood firm not only as queen, but as a woman who refused to be erased by her husband's ambition. That steadfastness carved the shape of history for Henry's desperation to discard her, broke England down. From Rome, Catherine's courage was not in victory, but in her refusal to surrender her truth. And Joan, the peasant girl who led armies, bore her humiliation with the same resolve that carried her through battle. Stripped and searched, declared pure, and then accused again, she clung to her vow of chastity as proof that her voices were of God. Even in her cell awaiting the flames, she held to her covenant. The English sought to reduce her to shame, but instead they gave France its virgin martyr, a symbol whose purity became armour even fire could not destroy. Their stories reveal the cruel paradox of their world, that a woman's body could be exalted as sacred yet treated as evidence, praised as the vessel of life yet violated in the name of politics, honoured in song and prayer yet humiliated in chambers where her dignity was stripped away. And yet their courage also reveals something greater. They remind us that women, though crushed beneath systems designed to break them, found ways to endure. Sometimes their resistance was loud, like Catherine's unshakable testimony. Sometimes it was silent, like Blanche's survival of a marriage without touch. Sometimes it was transcendent, like Joan's transformation into a saint in the very act of her destruction. These women remind us that humanity cannot be reduced to membranes, bloodstains, or written verdicts. They remind us that dignity persists even when stripped bare, that truth endures, even when written over by the pens of scribes, that courage burns, even when bodies turn to ash. Their ordeals belong not only to the past. Around the world today, women still face virginity tests, still suffer the shame of being reduced to purity, still struggle against the same logic that haunted Blanche, Catherine, and Joan. But their legacy is not only one of suffering, it is one of resistance. Each endured the cruelty of her age and by surviving left cracks in the structure of oppression. Through those cracks, light has entered for generations that followed. Why do their stories matter today? Because they reveal that systems of power, however brutal, are never unbreakable. Because they remind us that even when humanity is reduced to its most vulnerable state, courage can still rise. And because they echo into our present, urging us to see to resist, and to ensure that no woman ever again must prove her worth by the blood she bleeds or the silence she endures. Blanche, Catherine, Joan. Their bodies were examined, doubted, and condemned, but their humanity outlived their judges, their courage outlived their humiliations, their names outlived the cold chambers of power, and perhaps that is the truest legacy, that even when reduced to flesh they remained more than evidence. They remained women, defiant, enduring, and unforgettable. History often teaches us about kings' wars and treaties, but the stories of Blanche, Catherine and Joan remind us of something more intimate, that power is not only fought with armies and gold, but with control over the human body, especially women's bodies. From their suffering and endurance, we can draw lessons that still resonate today. The first lesson is about the dignity of endurance. Blanche of Navarre, humiliated in a cold chamber, did not rebel with swords or speeches. Her resistance was quieter, but no less real. She endured. She survived, and in surviving, she preserved her worth against a system designed to erase her. Sometimes courage does not look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like getting through humiliation without letting it crush your spirit. In our own lives, survival in the face of indignity is not weakness. It is resilience. The second lesson is about the power of truth spoken steadily. Catherine of Aragon's entire life was reduced to a single question. Had she been touched by Arthur before she married Henry? For decades she answered with the same unwavering words, no. She did not bend her truth to suit politics, nor did she yield under pressure from the most powerful man in England. Catherine teaches us that when everything is stripped away, our integrity is our greatest shield. To hold to the truth even when it costs us comfort is a form of victory no one can take. The third lesson is about the paradox of purity and power. Joan of Arc's virginity was twisted into a weapon by both her allies and her enemies. Yet she reclaimed it by making it part of her vow to God, a symbol of her own choice, rather than the church's property. In this, Joan reminds us that systems of oppression can sometimes be bent, if not broken, by the way we choose to carry ourselves within them. She teaches that meaning can be reclaimed even from tools meant to degrade us. A broader lesson emerges from all three: control thrives on fear, but even small acts of resistance weaken it. Women in medieval courts shared whispered recipes for deception, risked lies to save each other, and quietly outwitted those who sought to own them. These stories remind us that solidarity, however hidden, creates cracks in even the strongest walls. Today, when systems of power still try to define worth by gender, race, class, or purity, small acts of mutual protection remain revolutionary. Finally, their lives teach us the importance of remembering. Blanche. Catherine and Joan endured violations that courts and churches called normal, but centuries later we remember them not as humiliated victims, but as women of courage. Women who survived, women who forced the world to reckon with their humanity. Their stories remind us that oppression once shunned, but history can give voice. To tell these stories is itself an act of justice. The life lesson is clear. Dignity may be stripped, but courage endures. Truth may be doubted, but it survives. And no system, no matter how cold, cruel or sanctified, can erase the humanity of those who resist, even in silence. Thanks for being here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapters full of history and discovery.